Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, I'm Al. That's short for Alan. And I am joined by a very special guest today. I am joined by my friend Cam, who's a pro life activist, but he also happens to be an expert in military history. Let me give you two brief anecdotes. A few years ago, probably around 2014, I think, I was um, I was in Starbucks with Cam, and I asked a question about the Battle of Stalingrad. He 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 asked if I have paper, and then he for 2 hours he's teaching me about the Battle of Stalingrad, where the lines are, what the Germans did right, what they did wrong, what the Soviets did. Like, do you remember that, Cam?
I think so. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and then there's another time where we're talking about who's the greatest general of all time, and you said it was Hannibal, and you explained to a couple of us, there's a couple of us in that room, using the primary sources of his life, the kind of battles he did, his tactics at this battle, at that battle, at Cannae and Zama, and all these. My friend Jackie Shea here. God bless all pro-life activists, especially in Canada. Yeah, no, we're in the shadows of Mordor here. So yeah, but so Cam, welcome to my channel. Although you've
Thanks for having me.
been here before talking about pro-life stuff and crusades, today we are going to talk about medieval warfare. The role that the longbow played in its influence on chivalry. Now, I had said something on Twitter about how the longbow made chivalry obsolete. And then you commented on that. You're like, whoa, 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 not so fast, Alan. And I'm like, well, if
Yeah.
Cam says something, I got to take it seriously, you know? So,
Yeah.
and and then after that, he called me and we talked for about 20 minutes, and he's talking about, and so we've decided to do a show. So, all right, we are going to talk about the role the longbow played and its influence on chivalry, and we're going to talk about the Battle of Crecy and possibly some other battles. But yeah, let's start off. So, explain the role of chivalry during the medieval period.
So it's a really fascinating period because it's I think the only other time in history that some historians would argue was similar to this would have been the early Bronze Age, where you have the rise of the horse-drawn chariot. And how that created a warrior class elite where you have an expensive weapon that only the wealthy can have and only the wealthy who have been well trained can have. And so this warrior elite rises and kind of dominates all of society. And you see the same thing with the rise of the armored knight. So in about, in the 400s, 500s, 600s, 700, 800, in this period of time, you see the first use of stirrups in cavalry. And though this is important because before you had stirrups, it was very, very difficult to have true what's called shock cavalry. So if you read ancient primary historical accounts of battles, you'll often hear about cavalry, charging into the flanks of their enemy. But without stirrups, it's not what we would call shock cavalry. It's guys riding up the side and swinging, with the sword at somebody. It's not a lance coming in where the entire weight of the horse and the rider and the momentum of both at a full gallop is brought to a single sharp point at the tip of that lance into the body of another person, right? Because if you don't have stirrups, if you go in and you have that shock where everything stops all of a sudden, the horseman's just going to keep on going. Right.
Yep.
And so there's this important development in the of stirrups. Now, some historians argue, and this is a really, really, really debated point in history, about the Battle of Adrianople, where the Roman legions are basically wiped out by Goths.
Yep.
Most historians say that that's the end of Rome because of the Roman army as a real battlefield force, because they're under Constantine. You had the empire kind of divide its forces into two different tiers of forces. Those that defended the borders, which were lighter armed, and they're more usually mercenary barbarian soldiers, not true legionaries. Then you had the main battle army of Rome, which was the legionaries that we think of when you watch Gladiator, right? Those soldiers in the beginning battle, that would be that kind of main battle army.
Or Spartacus.
Or Spartacus, yeah. Although that's a different legion, right? So that's, I believe that would even be prior to the Marian reforms. So there's the Marian reforms, which create a professional army out of the citizen army. That might have actually been after the Marian reforms, but that's a big moment in history. But these what some historians argue is that the stirrup gives the mounted Goths an advantage against the Roman legions. I think that's vastly overplayed. I don't think the stirrup really is universally used. I don't think the technology is really truly perfected until much later. But the argument is, once you wipe out the Rome's main battle army and virtually everybody dies, all the centurions, all of the officers, everybody who knows the business of war is dead, and all you're left with is those light barbarian groups along the border, and that institutional knowledge disappears.
We're talking. We're still talking about the Battle of Adrianople, right?
Battle of Adrianople, yeah. So that's what some historians argue.
For those who don't know, that's in 378 AD. So that's yeah. And I've actually got a primary source on it over there, but we can talk about that.
Yeah. It's really an interesting development in the terms of the way that the Roman Empire ultimately starts to break down and to wear down, to become Germanicized as a result of all of this. But it suffices to say that at that point, you start to see the rise of this heavily armored shock cavalry from that point onwards, until by the time you get to the 10th century, in the 10th, 11th century, you have these professional soldiers called knights, or knights, or knuts, or then they are basically there's a series of law around it where they're the only ones that are allowed to wear a sword around the king and these types of things. And there's this professional warrior elite that now dominate society because they can take whatever they want, because there's no military force that is capable of defeating an armored knight who is trained in how to bring the entire weight of horse and rider at a full gallop to a single point to transfer that momentum into another opponent. And there's nothing that anybody else can do to stop it.
Would you say that that's the reason the First Crusade was so successful? That
Absolutely,
like the both the Turks and the Arabs had not seen a knight before, so they didn't know what to do. They had no countermeasures against this elite, vicious military unit.
Yeah, and keep in mind those Crusaders during the First Crusade. This is the early iteration of the knight, and these are ruthless warriors, right? I mean, Bohemond was not under any real chivalric code of any type, right? His one question would be, would it work? He had no problem with treachery and betrayal. I mean, he's basically a Viking in armor on horseback, who's somewhat Christianized, but still has lot of rough edges around him.
He ended up betraying Alexius Comnenus.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, he betrayed everybody.
And then he lost that war, and then he ended up becoming a vassal, and the contract he had to sign was so humiliating. If you read the Alexiad by Anna Komnena, she produces the whole document. It's so humiliating.
The funny thing is, for Bohemond, it wouldn't have been humiliating. He wouldn't have cared what the document said. Right? Like, for a later knight, this would be a utter humiliation, the code of chivalry and pride and all of that. To him, he's just a ruthless warrior who doesn't really care what's written down on paper. He's going to try whatever trick he can to win. And so if that means calling himself all sorts of nasty names, he's okay with that. He doesn't really care. And so there's that generation where the knights are about pure military efficiency, and that's how they gain power. That's how they became a dominant society, was through the utter exploitation of their military advantage in order to subordinate the peasantry, to take them primarily from being free peasants, free men, and turning them into serfs, which was done through the castellation, the process of building castles, in which armored knights resided. So you had this fortified strong point, often not made even of stone at first. Most castles weren't made of stone; they were made of wood for most of the medieval period. But it was just a strong point that villagers couldn't storm against somebody in armor. And then when he left that, he'd leave it on horseback with his armor. And so, like, there's nothing that the people could do once the Lord had set up his castle and had 5 or 6 knights around him. He's invulnerable to that, whatever village he wants to terrorize and turn into his serfs. So there's this process of castellation that goes along through the Middle Ages because of this. But as with all elites in society, you start with that first several generations being really tough military elites where they're passing along to the next generation the military ethos that made them the dominant force of society. But that erodes, right? If you're as wealthy as can, yeah, you get soft, right? Like, if you don't have to starve yourself and push yourself, why would you over time? And so you have that in that sense, a degeneration of the military capabilities, which is, in my opinion, the difference between the First Crusade and, say, the Fourth, Fifth, Sixth Crusades. There's definitely an element where the Islamic forces have come to understand the qualities of their opponents and how to fight back against them. But at the same time, there's a degeneration of the military efficiency of the knights. These are not the men that were fighting before. They care a lot more about protecting themselves, as is evinced by the amount of armor they start throwing on themselves. Those original knights were basically in a mail-clad hauberk and a steel helmet.
Okay, so like you talked about, like the Fifth and Sixth Crusade. We're getting into the 13th century, where the Crusaders on 2 or 3 of the Crusades, they try invading Egypt and stuff. And then, so okay, we've talked about chivalry. Now, talk about Edward the First and the English longbow.
Yeah, so England engages in a series of wars in the English Isles against the Scots, against the Welsh, and against the Irish. And because their population density is so high, England is the most powerful of all these groups in the English Isles. And in their wars against in Wales, where you've got really difficult terrain to fight in, it's not good terrain for cavalry. They noticed that the Welsh longbow is actually a remarkably effective weapon. And so in the process of
they got it from the Welsh. Oh,
yeah.
Interesting.
And so they basically declare that Englishmen have to train with the longbow, all Englishmen. It's intermittently upheld. I'm not fully aware of all the way that the law worked around that. My guess is there are tons of loopholes and all of that, but the law basically was that all men had to be proficient with the English longbow. And
not just men, the young ones too, right?
Yeah. Manhood starts at like 13 in England at this time.
Yeah, so. That's true. That's true, But like, I suppose it's kind of like the Swiss then. Like Swiss, you all gotta learn how to use the gun until age like 65, because you can be summoned. But back then it was the English longbow. And so
they're the only country that does this. And the interesting result of that is a vast reservoir of men who are capable of fighting wars, who are useful soldiers. So if you can imagine the medieval world where you have knights, and then you have their sergeants, who are called sergeants, who are people who are not of noble birth, but they're professional warriors, who typically would go into battle armored with less armor and less training, and probably a poor horse. If they had a horse, often they'd be dismounted and on foot. But then after that, then you'd say these would be the retainers, sometimes they're referred to as, of a lord. But then after that, you had the vast masses of the peasantry who were really useless in battle. In fact, for a large part, they were counterproductive because they would panic right away. They had no desire to be in the battle. They're just there because somebody's forced them to be there. But once their fear of what lies ahead of them is greater than their fear of their lord, or when their lord's no longer watching them because he's off charging, they're just going to disappear. And when And fear, like courage, is infectious on a battlefield. When one man runs, another's more likely to run, just like when one man stands, another's more likely to stand. And so when you have a large number of men who have no desire to be on a battlefield, in fact, the vast bulk of your army, uh, they're going to run really quickly. And that panic can spread very easily and very quickly. Right? But with the English, you've got this reservoir of useful soldiers. These are people who have been trained in a very powerful weapon, in the English longbow. Right? And to kind of put it into perspective, the English longbow, there are really two elements to any ranged weapon, whether you're talking pre or post gunpowder, right? And that is, or three elements to any ranged weapon. The first is their ability to penetrate armor, whether it's hardened leather or steel rings or steel plate. How much of that can they penetrate, right? That's the first element. The second element of any weapon is how fast does it fire? What's its rate of fire, right? Can you fire it really quickly or really slowly? And then the third element is how much training does it take to be proficient with that weapon, right? So with the English longbow, it takes a lot of training to be proficient. It has all right penetrative power. There's a lot of historical debate about how the degree to which the longbow can penetrate plate armor. The historical sources that we have indicate that it did penetrate what's called historical experimental archaeology, where we make these weapons today and we fire them and we test them, indicates that it couldn't. My suspicion is that it probably could, but wasn't compared to, say, a Genesese crossbowman, right? Which you see pop up in the records. The crossbow probably had greater penetrative power at a lower distance. It probably couldn't fire.
Keep in mind, though, if you're shooting at, say, a knight, you don't need to necessarily hit him. If you hit his horse, that's going to dismount him, because the horse will go into a fit or stuff like that. So it's not just
and I mean, the horse horses would be armored too.
Well, I actually reread the Chronicles, because you talked about that on the phone with that in night, about the armor piercing, and I kept out. I kept an eye out for that, and I don't think there's anything concrete. There's stuff that's vague and ambiguous that you could interpret it in that way, but it's vague. You kind of have to give it that interpretation. It specifically says it took out their horses, no problem.
Yeah.
But I look for armor piercing, and again, there's only vague stuff. There's nothing specific.
And as I was telling you over the phone, like in our conversation, there's a big difference between penetrating new armor that's like at the top of the class and penetrating, your grandfather's hand-me-down that hasn't, that's rusted away and hasn't really, right? Like, that's a lot easier to get through, kind of that third generational armor that was just in the warehouse for a while, and now you brought it out. You're like, oh no, I actually have to ride off now, and this, it's a half rusted, and that's probably a lot less effective
compared to something that
than
the blacksmith forged 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, exactly, right. So there's probably a lot of variations in how good the armor is, how good the bowman is, and all of this that play a role. But you're right. I mean, when somebody gets shot, like say a soldier gets shot in the chest in wearing bulletproof armor, gets shot in the chest today, his ribs are still broken.
Oh yeah, he'll be all bruised up, and
like it's not a pleasant thing. Like, it's very, very disruptive. So you can imagine being on the back of a horse where your entire core is keeping you on the horse, and you get hit by an arrow. Your armor might stop the arrow. Like, who knows what the actual internal damage from that is, and how, as you said, dismounting you or limiting your military capacity in some way, getting hit in the head. I mean, that even if your armor doesn't holds, you might still get a concussion from that.
Yeah, it's not good. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So there's this it's this powerful weapon, the English longbow, that the
So
English have made their average people capable of wielding.
yeah, there's no shortage of people they can recruit into their army. So
Yeah.
you talked about how at the time of Edward the First, who's known as
Mhm.
the Longshanks, also Hammer of the Scots, how
Yep.
in some battles with him and I think his son, because I think his son was at the Battle of Bannockburn, Edward the Second.
Yeah.
You talked about the Battle of Bannockburn and some other battle.
Yeah.
Um,
There's a
you
bunch of
had
battles that demonstrate these basic principles. So what the Scots do is very similar to the English. William Wallace actually is the man who comes up with this, and the Great Chronicle of Braveheart, the movie, is a fun watch, but not really very historically accurate in this
yeah,
in the slightest. And in
they
fact,
bend the
it makes
facts a bit. Yeah.
yeah, they bend the facts a great deal. Not the least of which is they make him less epic than he actually was, in my opinion. Um, he's one of those characters that if you tried to portray him in movies, people wouldn't buy him as a historical person. Like, it's incredible. But one of the things that he does is recognizing the power of the pike, basically, which is it's not a unique idea. The Macedonian sarissa is similar in many ways to this. Uh, but basically, the idea is if you've got a knight who's got a 20-foot long stick that's pointing at you, well, you're going to need a 21-foot long stick to keep him off, right? So you get a long, pointy weapon, and these weapons often weren't even pointed with steel. They could just be sharpened wood that you hold out, and that gets to their horse before their lance can get to you. And you densely pack these people together, right? And you just have a wall of very long, pointy sticks pointing at the cavalry charge. The cavalry is not going to be able to get through that for two reasons. One, because if they try, they're all going to be impaled on the sticks. And two, horses don't allow themselves to be impaled on sticks.
Yeah, the horse will refuse to run at it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the horse isn't an idiot. It knows what happens if it gets impaled on something. It's not. It wants nothing to do with that. And no amount of spurring it on is going to cause it to impale itself on a stick unless it trips or something like that. And so you have these so that's what the Scots do in response to that. And at the Battle of Stirling Bridge with William Wallace, the Scots hold off the English chivalry, but they're defeated because they're in this dense pike formation. And English longbowmen take up a position on high ground and then just pepper that pike formation with arrows until the pike formation dissolves, and then the cavalry can charge on through the holes in it.
What battle is this?
That's the Battle of Stirling Bridge.
Stirling Bridge, okay.
At Bannockburn, which is that was Edward the First. So Edward the First knew his business, right? Like he was no fool. He understood how to fight wars. He was a very effective military commander.
Well, he was a crusader too.
He was a crusader, yeah.
An assassin even tried to kill him, and he beat the snot out of the assassin.
Yeah, he was a tough customer, and so he understood his business. But his son was not a tough customer. His son was not a very good commander of men at all. And so his expectation of the Battle of Bannockburn, where the Scots were outnumbered at least 4-1, at least, his expectation was that his chivalry would be able to sweep away whatever Scots rabble is in front of them. But of course, Robert the Bruce, who's also a very tough customer, ends up fighting him in a marsh. So his horsemen can never really get up to speed. But even the parts of the battle that are outside of the marsh, they can't break through the pike formation. And what he does to counter the longbowmen that he knows are eventually going to make an appearance in this battle is he sets aside his light cavalry with the goal of basically being able to get amongst the longbowmen before the longbowmen can really stop them.
Light cavalry.
Light cavalry, yeah. And so, well, what the English refer to as hobbitlar, and the Scots often referred to as moss troopers. So these are lighter cavalry on a lighter pony. They don't have the full heavy armor set, and they're able to traverse more difficult terrain. They're able to move more quickly on the battlefield, and they're able to deal with light units like horse archers, or like archers, sorry, more effectively, provided they can get amongst them. And so that's what he does. He scatters them and defeats them in the battle. The chivalry can't break the pike formation. And so that's really the first time that you see the commoners, the average man or man, able to defeat the noble classes in fair combat.
Right? And this is a big development. We're talking about
the Battle of Bannockburn.
The Battle of Bannockburn. And they were also able, so the Scottish used light cavalry
to rout the horse, to rout the longbow,men, yeah.
To rout the longbowmen, because like they're like, because if you shoot at them, they are a lot faster. Like they don't have all this armor, you know, and they don't have a huge weapon. So like like cavalry, they just have a sword, or
they'll have a spear and a sword, but they wouldn't have. So their horses typically were much less armored. They might have a chainmail to the rider, for example, but it wouldn't be the full set of armor that you see on a knight.
Okay,
and that was because Scotland was poorer, and you'd see also the horses would be smaller and bred for speed. So a lot more akin in a way to an Arabian horse than to the destriers of chivalry, which were designed just to bear as heavy a burden as they possibly could, but not for speed.
Yeah, because I mean, at that point, like the speed wouldn't really matter, right? Like the idea is, okay, but as soon as I get, like, if I'm a big armored knight with a huge horse, as soon as I get to my opponent, he's done, you know. But
yeah, exactly. Yeah, the idea was just get me to that battle, right? But the and the longbow could be devastating to light cavalry as well if there was some sort of something in between that prevented them easily getting to the longbow. Even something as simple as the old English trick of the longbowmen bringing a stake with them into battle and putting that in front of them. I mean, that could be a very devastating trick, even against light cavalry.
That happened at the Battle of Crecy. Right?
Yeah, the English, and that was a typical English trick from that point onwards. After actually,
all right. So the Battle of Bannockburn was in the 13 teens. I don't know the year exactly.
1317 and 1318, I want to say.
Yeah, that's King Edward II, and then his son Edward III takes over in 33. I want to say. Anyway, long story short, in 1337 he starts the 100 Years' War with his invasion. As far as I know, there's a naval battle or two, but eventually they get on land, and the first large-scale battle of full armies, keep in mind these are huge armies, is the Battle of Crecy. Now tell us a bit about the Battle of Crecy. It's 1346 in August. It's the summer. So explain to our audience the background of the Battle of Crecy.
So the English strategy is what's called the chevauchée. And their idea is they're going to force the French to negotiate, right? Force them to the table by destroying the French lands, basically by going through and burning a swath through the French countryside. And this will help pay for, this will pay more than pay for the war, right? Just looting the French countryside, and forcing the French king to the negotiating table by basically impoverishing his citizens if he doesn't. But in the course of one of these chevauchées, the French king manages to corner and force the English king into a battle. Now, the French significantly outnumber the English. Probably at least 2 to 1, if not more. Al, you might remember the numbers a bit better than I do, but
Yeah, it's
significantly
about
outnumbered.
it's about 2 to 1, and at this point, both armies are large. Although the English are outnumbered 2 to 1, they still have a large army.
They do.
If you go to like say 10 years later, the Battle of Poitiers, there's smaller armies because they've been thinned out by the Black Plague.
Mhm.
Both sides have. Yeah.
Both sides have, and it's also important to remember that the English at Poitiers, say for example, have even more embraced this new model that I'm going to explain about how they organize their forces. So the typical way that medieval armies would be raised is the king would send a summons to all his noblemen to bring their armies or to bring their vassals to a particular point. And then they would have, I believe it was 60 days, where they owed military service to their king every year, a maximum of up to 60 days where they'd owe military service to their king. But then they'd have to be sent home to gather in the harvest and all of those day-to-day things, right? And the feudal system is predicated on military service. So there'll be one layer of feudal nobility that would owe military service in the service of their people to their king for 60 days of the year. And then they would further subdivide the land and peasantry to work the land to people who would owe feudal service to them, and so on and so forth until you get to the peasant who just owes feudal service to their lord and doesn't own their land, and they're typically serfs. And so you'd call up the forces that you have from your feudal subsidiaries, and they'd gather together, and this would be just a dog's breakfast of what you're gathering, right? Like there's no military uniformity to this at all. You're going to have your knights and chivalry and their trainers and best friends, and so you'll have their sergeants and their mounted sergeants and their dismounted sergeants, and then you just have the peasant who's called from the field and doesn't really know what he's doing here, and he has maybe a pitchfork, and that's his weapon. And this is the mass army. But what the English are starting to do now is they recognize campaigning across the English Channel. It's very difficult to do a true campaign under those circumstances where you have to gather your army in England, cross the English Channel, and then fight a campaign in France, all in under 60 days. Right? It takes 20 days to gather for your summons to go out and the men to come in, and then it's going to take 20 days to get them across, and then you got 20 days to fight with them in England, in France. I mean, that's just nothing against an opponent who's got, and so you're relying increasingly on paid armies. So these are not feudal levies that are coming out to fight, in so much as they are nobles who, when the summonses come out, say, I'm not going to ride out, but I'll give you this amount of money. And the king uses that money then to hire and to keep in his pay a certain number of longbowmen or knights or whatever it is that they're going to compose their army of. And then that's the army they go out and fight with. So the English armies tend to be much smaller throughout this period because they're more professionalized. But the result is they don't have any of those peasants with the pitchforks who are terrible soldiers and who just spread fear in your army. Their soldiers are
with the longbows.
They're equipped with the longbow, and they're professionals. Right? These are people who didn't really have to be there. They could have stayed home. It's only the best and the strongest and the toughest that are going to do their bit. So everyone uses a longbow and is capable of it. But the best and the toughest of these longbowmen seek professional service as longbowmen, as retinue longbowmen, as they're referred to.
Did they get paid a lot, like enough to be a member of the? Although I don't think there'd be a huge middle class at that point. You think that maybe be like a?
So,
or are they still poor?
They're still poor. They're still commoners. They wouldn't be part of any middle class of any type, at first, anyways. But what you see right after the Battle of Crecy, and this is the first time, is each and every man who fights and survives the day of Crecy becomes a very wealthy man the next day. right? Like,
Yeah.
and we'll explain how that happens. But like,
Yeah,
and so
well,
suddenly this kind of behavior where you're not really being paid a lot, but you're getting the opportunity to loot France, and you're getting the opportunity to make a lot of money and to have a very, uh, a very good lifestyle. Imagine, like, in many ways, your typical narco soldier in one of the cartels today, right? These people are probably a little more morally aligned with Christianity than the cartel members, but it's basically the same idea. You have this chance to get rich, at least in the way people see it, and to live a very wealthy lifestyle for at least very short periods of time, until you're burned through all your money. You have very little hope, anyways. I mean, just like the narco cartel members in Mexico today, you have a choice between being a poor Mexican worker or whatever it is, or living a more glamorous, glitzy lifestyle as this narco soldier. But the odds of you surviving aren't great. The odds of, but there's still people who are going to take that chance, right? Who are going to roll the dice on their hope.
Well, as far as I know, the vast majority of longbowmen at the Battle of Crecy survived. Am I correct?
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
Vast majority in all battles. The vast majority of people were going to survive in this period of time.
Yeah, in Crecy, Poitiers, and Agincourt, and possibly some of the later ones as well. My knowledge of the 100 Years' War gets a bit hazy after Joan of Arc, but ironically, that's when the French start to make the comeback, right? So okay, I've got a clip from Kings and Generals. I clipped it. This is from the channel Kings and Generals. We're going to use this under fair use. We're not going to monetize this video, so this is perfectly legal. What we're doing. You've watched things from Kings and Generals, right? Do you think their stuff's fairly good, or?
Yeah, it's excellent.
All right, let's pop up a clip from the Battle of
Fated ridge between Crecy and Wedicourt, which looked south into a valley, daring the French to try and knock him off it.
Just say pause if you want to.
Exact figures for army size are impossible to calculate, but Edward's was probably just over 14,000 strong, made up of 2,500 chainmail-clad men-at-arms and dismounted knights, 2,500 spearmen, and 3,250 light cavalry, known as hobilars. A further 7,000 were England's lethal archery corps, armed with longbows and armor-piercing bodkin arrows. Since the reign of Edward I, every English village had been tasked with contributing men to the National Reserve of Archers precisely for this kind of battle, and were legally obliged to train in the longbow's use each week. This force was divided into 3 groups. 2 were in front on the left and right. The former was commanded by Earls Arundel and Northampton, while they followed Edward III's son, the 16-year-old Black Prince, into battle. The King's division remained in the rear as a strategic reserve. All 3 had infantry in the centre and longbowmen on the flanks, while fronted by a series of pits, trenches and stakes to serve as a defence. Edward went in among his men, inspiring and encouraging them, so that men who were inclined to cowardice became brave, whilst also warning them not to plunder until he gave permission, as doing so would endanger the army. Morale.
So, just pause for a second here. Do you think this setup is fairly accurate?
Yeah, I mean, to my understanding, that's basically what happens, and it's important to remember. There's a bunch of things to remember about this battlefield, right? As I said, the longbow has a handful of big advantages. One, it has a very high rate of fire. So compared to a crossbow, a crossbow can fire once, maybe twice a minute. Longbow, you could fire off 10 shots in a minute.
Wow!
Right.
So
you have this huge advantage. In fact, in many ways, The longbow is not supplanted as a weapon until the mid-19th century in terms of its effectiveness as a weapon. It's the reason why people stop using the longbow and start picking up the musket. Isn't that the musket's a better weapon than the longbow necessarily. It's that the musket is actually easier to train people to use. Because the longbow is such a heavy draw weight that I couldn't just pick up and use a longbow. It takes a lifelong dedicated practice to be able to draw this thing, right? I can draw a very weak bow, but not a longbow. In fact, it's such a powerful weapon that habitual drawing of the longbow to use and train in it will warp your spine. Right?
Well, that's why they had to train since childhood. Those things aren't easy. Now, there's something else you notice here. The English, I've kind of noticed this in each battle I've said. The English throughout the centuries, they're always thin, but they're long. That's like you see, they're very long here, but they're thin. Whereas the French are shorter but deeper. Do you want to comment on that, or?
This is actually a classic formation for a side that has a lot of ranged units or ranged weaponry, right? Because I can't shoot a longbow if there's a person standing right in front of me, because I'm going to hit him, not my target. And so if you want to use a longbow, you want to stretch out the line. That has the additional advantage of getting what's called enfilade fire, so fire in from the edges. So if your opponent's got more of a column formation than a line formation, right? If they're narrower, if their column is narrower than your line is going to be shooting in from the sides on that. And often it's easier to hit somebody on the side, or you're more likely to get a damaging shot on the side than you are directly on. I mean, first of all, their head's in that direction, so they'll see the arrows that are coming that way, where they're not going to necessarily see things coming from their side. But in addition, I mean, your shield can only be up or to the side. It can't be in both spots at the same time.
Yeah.
So
all right,
yeah.
So I'm going to click play. If there's something you want to comment on, just tell me.
And discipline taken care of. The king allowed his troops to break ranks so they could sit, eat, and replenish their strength before battle was joined. The king himself took up command of the field on an elevated windmill near his reserve division. Philippe's strung-out French army began its approach by late afternoon, consisting of just over 30,000 troops, 12,000 mounted knights, 12,000 infantry, and 6,000 crossbowmen. Since the sun was about to set, and the army was exhausted from the day's march, France's Valois king intended to heed the counsel of his outriders to encamp for the night and attack at dawn, when the soldiers would be better rested and prepared. However, a combination of chivalric pride and Philippe's lack of control created a situation where he had to attack. It was close to 6 p.m. by the time Valois...
So, it kind of understand, this is one of those weaknesses that I was talking about. This is the kind of weakness that Bohemond would not have been subject to. He wouldn't have cared what people said about him, right? And so you have this devolution of knightly honor that's now impeding military efficiency. Because to the French king, he outnumbers the English king. He's got him cornered. He's got him in a position where he has to fight if Philip chooses to fight. He has more knights than his opponent, which is considered to be the winning battle. He doesn't want to sit down and rest his men because he doesn't want to send to the world the message that he was afraid of fighting this enemy. Right? He needed to make sure that he had every advantage possible before he went and fought this enemy. Otherwise, he was afraid of the outcome. This was one of he didn't want to be seen as afraid. And so that's why he makes these decisions that from a military perspective are just silly. They're just silly. And Edward had far less compunction about these things. He made sure that his men were rested, were fed, and were ready to go. But Philip was afraid that he'd be seen as afraid. And so ironically, that fear drives him to make a silly battlefield decision.
So it's a combo of fear and ego that prompts him to thrust his his army that's marched all day into battle.
Yeah. And I mean, if you're a French king, if you're a king of knights, these are important factors to keep in mind, right? Your authority as a leader doesn't come from the fact that you're a king. Any man is willing to disobey you, right? Any nobleman is willing to disobey you if they don't think that you're a good enough king. And so there's this need to be seen as hyper masculine and as capable and as fearless and as tough in order to maintain the confidence of your army. So it's not necessarily the most ill-placed fear, but it does cause them to be silly about this chivalric code.
Okay, all right.
Contingents began their assault. First to advance up the ridge were the Genoese and French crossbowmen, who lacked their protective pavis shields. As they went forward, a short but incredibly intense thunderstorm soaked the battlefield, damaging the crossbows and rendering them useless. In contrast, the unhindered English longbowmen stepped forward.
So, in order for a bow, whether it's a longbow or a crossbow, to work, the bowstring needs to be capable of storing kinetic energy. Right, that's basically what it's doing. Is it's allowing you to store kinetic energy through the pull and drawing of the string. A soaked bowstring just doesn't store kinetic energy very well. So whereas the English longbowmen keep their in a pouch, right, their bowstrings in a pouch. The French have it on. The French and the Genoese had it still on their bows in the middle of the storm.
And
so their bowstrings are drenched and are not nearly as effective as a longbow's, which has been stored properly in this case.
Okay.
And let loose a storm of arrows, slaying a great number of their French counterparts and setting the rest to flight. Witnessing what they had saw as detestable cowardice from their fleeing skirmishers, the Count of Alençon bellowed, "Ride down this rabble who block our advance," at which point the first contingent of knights charged forward and unceremoniously cut down their own infantry. This pointless exertion bogged down the knightly advance and left it struggling at the base of the ridge. At this range, the longbowmen loosed with deadly precision, slaying the French and panicking their horses, the latter helped by 3 organ guns which made a clamour of noise. Though some of the heavily armoured warriors managed to reach the English line, they were hacked to pieces by Edward's dismounted knights. The first charge had been a complete disaster, but the day was not yet over.
So Edward III was the son of Edward II, who fought the Battle of Bannockburn. And Edward III fought the Scots and understood, as you can see by the proportion of his forces that were hobitlars or light cavalry. He also made sure that in this battle, his knights dismounted. And they still used their lances, but they shortened their lances by about 5 feet just to make them basically into pikes. Right?
Yeah, they talk about his wars against the Scots in this book before he starts the 100 Years' War.
Yeah.
And no, that's interesting because you mentioned that's known as the Second Scottish War of Independence. I guess I know a lot more about that one than I know about the first one because, I mean, but I know that this book has quite a bit of the first war, but I don't know because I haven't read this one apart from the portion of the Battle of Crecy.
So this is Edward III really learning from this, though, learning from the Scots, from the lessons he learned in the Scots War, and combining the natural English advantages of the longbowmen with the Scottish wisdom of men on foot with pikes. And you see that the French chivalry get to within fighting distance of the English lines, but now they're sitting ducks basically for English chivalry armed almost with pikes to just drive them off, fend them off very easily. Yeah.
So just curious, who's doing the main amount of the commanding? Is it Edward III or his son, the Black Prince?
In this battle will be Edward III. His son performs incredibly well in this battle. For a man who's 14, 15?
16.
16? Yeah, he's very young.
Yeah.
He hasn't actually been knighted until this battle. And the exact line, as men are encouraging him at the height of the battle, you'll probably hear this. Men are encouraging the advisors of Edward III are encouraging them to send his son more reinforcements, and his line is simply, "Let the lad win his spurs." Right?
Yeah,
but,
bet that happens. Yeah.
Yeah. But it's Edward III's battle plan, and the Black Prince at this point in time isn't yet the Black Prince, but he's just a figurehead in the line that's just holding the line. He's just being the man on the spot there. So he doesn't have really any tactical control of his battle.
Okay, all right.
Undaunted by the initial failure, France's mounted knights continued to mount charges on the English line, putting particular pressure on the English right flank, where the young Black Prince was almost killed. Almost surrounded by the superior numbers of his enemy, the Black Prince sent for help from his father, who refused and famously stated, "Let the boy win his spurs, for I want him, please God, to have all the glory." After a while, however, the king did send 20 hand-picked knights to assist his son, who found that the Black Prince's contingent had already managed to repulse the charge and were now recovering before the enemy returned. In a subsequent attack, the blind King of Bohemia, John, ordered his knights to tie their horses to his own and led their liege into battle. This charge began well, managing to get past the archers, but they were then all cut down by the English infantry. The French unsuccessfully charged 15 times in all, each becoming more disorganized and hopeless than the last. As the battle progressed, even Philippe VI himself joined the fighting. He was injured by an arrow and had more than one horse killed under him before the battle finally calmed. Witnessing the disaster that was unfolding, one of the Valois king's vassals persuaded him to withdraw. He did so reluctantly, fleeing with what was left of his army to a nearby royal chateau and then all the way to Amiens. In the dark, the English slept on their ridge, not realizing just how much of a terrible toll they had inflicted on the French. They had lost less than 100 men, while Philippe had lost over 10,000, including 1,500 lords and knights. While Edward III's tired troops were in no position to chase Philippe, he had gained a great victory and wanted to exploit it, marching to the port of Calais after his army rested and putting it to siege. As the town slowly started.
All right. So we've just finished Crecy here. Your final comments on Crecy.
It's a very interesting battle because in a really unique move, one of the great chivalric kings of England, Edward III, abandons heavy cavalry as his main strategy in a major conflict, in a major battle. Right? He had none of his men fight mounted in this battle, whether you're a lord or a peasant. Everyone's on foot, and this is unheard of. Right? And it was a very intentional decision that he made.
Okay, now, say hypothetical. I'm going to ask you a question. I'm going to put you on the spot. Say you were King Philip VI in that battle. What would you have done?
So first of all, I mean, hindsight being 2020, it's easy to make these types of observations after the fact. But I would have waited till the next day.
Yeah,
I would have ensured that my crossbowmen had their bows dry, not wet. I would have also made sure that they had their pavise shields. You'll note that comment that was made. A pavise shield is basically a giant shield that an archer would wear on his back, a crossbowman, so that when he's reloading his bow, he could turn his crossbow. He could turn, because the crossbow takes like a minute to reload, right? So he could turn his back to the enemy and reload the crossbow and still have protection. right? Because it's just strapped to his back.
Mhm.
I would make sure they had their babiche shields. I'd make sure that they had their bows dry. Give the men a chance to sleep at night. And then I would have sent my archers along the wings.
Archers along the wings. Okay.
Yeah.
And so,
And flanked the English rather than charging them. I would
so
have sent in my infantry along the front, and then the cavalry and the archers along the side to flank in on the edges.
okay, and so would you do anything specific on the side the Black Prince is on?
I mean, it would depend on the topography of the area. You'll note that it's a giant ridge, right? So basically, what you want to,
Yeah.
what if you're the French, you don't want to be charging up the ridge. You want to be charging parallel along it, right? You'll also remember at the very beginning they talked about how the English had prepared their positions. They had pits, caltraps, which are basically giant, like giant iron nails stuck together out in front of their position. So horses charging over that. This is chaos, absolute chaos. You can't charge, heavy cavalry can't charge into this position. And yet these lessons have not been learned by by the French, who have not fought the Scots, who used all of these tactics, as they had no heavy cavalry to speak of. And so they used every tactic in the book to try to, they came up with all these tactics to try to defeat heavy cavalry. So the English just copy and paste. They take the position on a ridge, they dismount their infantry, their archers, and basically pikemen or billmen, and then they prepare the position. But if you attack it from the end, you have your cavalry usually go around the edges. They're not charging uphill. They're not charging into a prepared position. They're able to hit their opponents on the flank, which is always better than to hit them head on. And you're able to use your heavy infantry, or your not your heavy infantry, but your infantry, your peasants and what have you, along the front to keep the enemy pinned in that frontal position. Right? And the enemy can no more use their cavalry against your infantry, right? Your light melee infantry, than you can use yours against their prepared defenses, because they're going to have to charge over those same caltraps to get to you.
Okay. Now, okay, that's interesting. Yeah, and of course hindsight's always 2020. Did King Philip, I don't know if did he know about the longbow prior to this battle?
He probably did, but
he didn't know how effective
it's a matter
it would
of prejudice, right? I don't know if you're a World War II guy, but for all of you who are, you'll remember that one of the biggest problems that the Western powers faced fighting Japan in the Second World War was we were completely unready for an Eastern power to have soldiers who were as badass as our own, or more. Right?
So the German soldiers weren't like that? The Wehrmacht weren't like that?
Oh, they were. They absolutely were. They were the best in the world. Without question, the German army in the Second World War were the best army in the world, man for man. But we weren't expecting a British commander in the Far East thought that one Brit was worth 10 Japanese, just not because they had poor training or not because they didn't have the equipment. Their equipment was good, decent. Their training was good, decent. It was just a racial thing. Right? It was pure blind racism that ended up biting them in the rear end. Because as it turns out, a Japanese soldier with the same training, the same discipline, the same tactical command was more than capable of was capable of handling in a British soldier.
So I suppose at the end it just boils down to them underestimating their opponent.
Yeah, they didn't believe that they didn't believe it was possible for a commoner to be able to fight on equal terms with a knight.
Okay, so let's fast forward 10 years. The next big battle in the 100 Years' War is called the Battle of Poitiers. I don't have a clip of this one. We'll just have to. As I mentioned before, the armies aren't as big because the Black Plague has taken its toll on both sides. But it's similar. They're outnumbered about 2 to 1. It's not the same king. It's King John II. You think things would have been different if King Philip had been there again, or
I
because
doubt
he
it.
had seen it? No.
I don't think the French at this point in time know that they lost because they were fighting war wrong.
Yeah, because for those who don't know, uh, the Battle of Poitiers, which was 10 years later, essentially turned into Crecy 2.0. In fact,
Basically,
in some ways, it was even worse because the king was captured in
now,
that
which is a
battle, whereas in
catastrophe.
Crecy, the king got away.
It's a catastrophe for your king to be captured. I mean, that's the amount that they had to pay in ransom
Yeah.
bankrupted France, and that's the reason why France basically doesn't recover for a generation after that. It was a catastrophe, even more so than Crecy. And you're
So
right; they should have seen
you,
it coming because it was just the English did the exact same thing.
yeah, like King Edward III learned from his father's failure at the Battle of Bannockburn.
Mhm.
You would think that John II would have learned from King Philip, but he
I mean, there
essentially
were
tries the
several
same.
shellackings the English took from Robert the Bruce under Edward II, and Edward II never learned his lesson. Some of the battles were in England itself. Uh,
Well, the Battle of Poitiers. I'm going to assume offhand that the guy in control of the English army was the Black Prince, right?
yeah, his
Yeah.
father
So
wasn't even
he's.
there.
Oh, really? Oh,
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah. So he's fighting against King John. Um, and essentially the same thing happens again. And I suppose. Oh, okay. So you have that cripples France for another, and then I think in 1360, I could have the year wrong. There's kind of like a small truce between England and France, and it puts the 100 Years' War on pause until I think 1369. Am I correct?
Yeah, that sounds about right. Yeah.
Yeah, and it starts up again, and then things continue, and then it pauses again around because Edward the Black Prince didn't become king because his father
Mhm.
just lived
No,
so
no.
long he outlived him. So his son Richard II eventually becomes king. And then eventually things get heated again in the early 1400s, and at the Battle of Agincourt, it's the longbowmen again who like I've not ever read a primary source on the Battle of Agincourt. I've I've got an English chronicle in the mail which I think covers it, but I don't have it now. It's the same thing, right? It's longbow. Like his army was
It's the
mostly
same basic
longbow.
pattern of the English. The English strategy is very, very similar through all three battles. First of all, position your archers on as high ground as you can find. That's their basic tactical doctrine. You find some sort of high ground, find some sort of defensive impediment in front of them, enhance that defensive impediment however you can. So in Crecy and Poitiers, it was the ridge that they then enhanced with caltrops, ditches, and as we talked about at the beginning, the archers would bring wooden stakes, large wooden stakes that they would then fasten into the ground in front of them, stand behind it, and fire behind that. And it's kind of a neat, almost counterpoint. The crossbowmen are so interested in protecting themselves that they bring with them the pavis into the battle, that giant shield. The English longbowmen are so interested in killing their enemies, they bring a giant wooden stake with them into the battle. They're confident of being able to pick off their opponents whenever they come near. They just don't want to get anybody to allow them to get near. It's an interesting difference in mentality. But so that's their strategy. And at Agincourt, the battle, most of the fight takes place on lower ground, actually, below the archers, and swampy area. Once again, like Bannock
Yeah,
Burn, it's
yeah.
swampy. Uh, because there's a big rainstorm the night before. So the cavalry have a really hard time gaining momentum. And that's what
A lot of
chivalry
mud.
needs, as I said at the beginning. Chivalry needs to be able to get momentum so they can transfer the entire weight of horse and rider to the point of the spear. And that can penetrate anything.
So yeah, essentially their knights get bogged down in the mud from the rainstorm the night before, and
The
then
archers
at
pick
that
them
point,
off.
it's the longbowmen just going to town on the knights who are barely moving.
And then once they run out of arrows, which they do at Agincourt, they run out of arrows. They charge in with giant wooden mallets and just start bashing in skulls. Like some of the things they do at Agincourt, you're like, how are guys gutsy enough to do that? Unarmored gentlemen with like giant wooden mallets, jumping
That's a
off of
pretty
large
epic
rocks on the
battle,
knights.
Agincourt.
Yeah.
Like I don't know how the English won that one. Like that was like they had a lot going against them in that battle, but
They did. But in the end, if you're a French soldier and you had your rear end handed to you at Poitiers and you had your rear end handed to you at Crecy and things start to go a little south at Agincourt, you're like,
wow.
okay, I'm out. Whereas if you're an Englishman and things went well for you at Crecy, went well for you at Agincourt, you're a veteran, you've been through many battles, you're going to have a lot more staying power. And often in many of these medieval battles, what matters isn't so much the person that actually the side that has the advantage, but the side that just has more stomach to keep fighting for longer.
So okay, we've had Crecy, we've had Poitiers, we've had Agincourt, three huge battles that essentially play out the same way. The longbows make mincemeat of the French knights. Now, when are the French? Because the French eventually win the 100 Years' War. When do they adapt to the longbow and devise countermeasures to stopping them?
Basically, Joan of Arc is the first one to do it.
Really?
And when the English, so there's one battle where Joan is in command of the army, and it's not a huge battle, but the English retreat to they get their archers to go on top of their hill, and she just shoots cannon at them on the hill. And cannon weren't that common, but I mean, like they're like, okay, you can stay there all you want. We'll just pound away with these really, really, really poor quality cannon, but I can still shoot at you, and you can't shoot at me. So
good job, Joan. It's not like send in the knights.
And all it takes is doing that until your opponent's a little bit unsettled, and then you're able to send in your knights who can close with the longbowmen. So if you can close with the longbowmen at speed before they can knock out your horses, they're done. They stand no chance against an armored knight at speed, right? And if the pike, there's no pike wall to meet them,
Or
you can
those
just kind
traps or whatnot.
or caltraps or whatever it is, and yeah, there's no prepared defenses. You can just walk on over them. So the idea, and this is what what our initial debate on Twitter was were knights obsolete? Did the Battle of Crecy render knights obsolete? And my argument would be no, it didn't, any more than the Battle of Bannock Burn did. What it meant, though, with these battlefield developments of pike and
Cam?
can you hear me?
Yeah, you paused for about 10 seconds.
Oh, sorry. What this development means is that knights can no longer win on any battlefield under any conditions at all times. There are now things that can defeat knights in particular battles. So how you employ your knights suddenly change. They're no longer the nuclear weapon of the battlefield where it doesn't matter how many tanks you have, your opponent has one nuke and you're done, right? I mean, to have a very crass and
Oh, Cam, we lost Cam. Oh, just as it was getting interesting too. We'll have to wait till he comes back. So no, that's interesting. So I'm going to recap what we saw here. Hold on, I'm gonna text Cam. Let me just. So essentially, oh, I just got texted by someone. Where did Cam go? So, all right. So essentially, what Cam was trying to tell us is, you've got those 3 battles, and then after that, the French had to learn that the knight was not the elite unit they thought it was. That it played a significantly different role. You had to use it more strategically instead of oh, nice, we have Cam back.
Sorry about that.
All right, Cam's back. Okay,
Yeah.
so you were trying to say that the knight essentially, instead of becoming an like the elite unit, had to be used more carefully.
Yeah, exactly.
In order for it to be effective, because like for example, let's go back a couple centuries. At the Battle of Hattin, Saladin manages to surround the army. It's not all knights, but there's knights there, and he peppers them with his horse archers. But keep in mind that they didn't have horse archers in Europe. That's more of an Asian thing.
Mm-hmm.
So they didn't have that haltering the knights. But eventually, you have the English longbow, which
and pikemen are the big one. That's the one that most European nations choose, whether it's Switzerland or the Germans or the Scots. And the Spanish eventually pick up pikemen as well. So, and the French do too.
Weren't the Swiss fairly famous for their pikemen?
They're very famous. That's the original reason why the Swiss Guard was brought in place, because they were famous pikemen and became famous mercenaries.
Interesting. Now, well, what was I going to say? I forgot about something. Okay, so the 100 Years' War ends in 1453. In the summer of 1453. By the way, side note, that's one of the reasons the Pope kept telling people to go defend Constantinople, but the French and English couldn't go because they were finishing off the 100 Years' War. And by the time they were finished, it had already fallen to the Turks. But so it ends in 1453. So if you're a French knight in 1453, what so like okay, so oh wait, I gotta ask a better question. Okay, the next major war after that is the War of the Roses in England. That's kind of a civil war, right? So were knights used in that war?
They were.
I'm not an expert on the war. Okay.
They were, but they tended to be used much in the same way that Edward III was employing knights, and Henry V at Agincourt was employing knights. They tended to be employed dismounted and surrounded by billmen and longbowmen. But you see, for example, increased use of artillery. The great Earl of Warwick, the Kingmaker, was famous for his artillery, and he was a famous military innovator in the way he fought battles and the way he conducted himself. And you see, in a sense, the democratization of military combat. So in England, the long-term effect of the longbow was to reduce the importance of knights, because there was a weapon that 2 or 3 longbowmen was worth a knight, but it costs a heck of a lot less to employ 3 longbowmen than it does to employ 1 knight.
Yeah, and like you have the cost of like to build the longbow, which I can't imagine was too much, but you didn't have to forge any armor or feed a horse or constantly or
Exactly.
Yeah,
And you can treat
so
them a
you
lot
get more
differently,
bang for
right?
the
Like
buck.
you can give orders to a longbow, and you really can't to a knight. They were, and so it democratizes things, right? And that's why you see a decrease in the importance of the House of Lords, an increase in the importance of the House of Commons. That starts around. I mean, it starts earlier than this, obviously, but the House of Commons is basically a place for knights who were considered the commons of that time to have their say, but increasingly it actually becomes the common person, right? Or
So
yeomen, like
would you say
freemen, who become increasingly important in English politics. Uh,
would you
because,
say that oh, sorry.
oh, yeah, no, continue, continue.
Well, I'm just saying, like, does this kind of is this the reason or a factor of the creation of the middle class in England?
I don't know if it's that simple. So England is a bit different in that because of its Anglo-Saxon roots and because of its proximity to the sea, uh, it was a lot more amenable to a middle class of merchants growing up. Because I mean, a middle class is merchants, right? And middle class doesn't become significant in size until the 19th century.
Well, yeah, like that's when it increases, like it goes exponentially up. But like I read now, keep in mind this is a historian, it's not a primary account, that at the time of the Reformation in England, in the city of London, 30 to 50% of the men, of the adult men, keep in mind adults like age 13 or 14, could read, which was pretty much more than any city in Europe.
Mhm.
So, I mean, I think at that time you'd have to be somewhat of middle class to learn to read, right? Or
So I'm not fully versed in this, but one of the things that's often forgotten is the Reformation actually sets the education of average people back by about 100 years because of the wars of religion, because of all that takes the focus off of getting education. And there was a degree of primary education that was starting to come into play before the Reformation. An increasingly, so a surprisingly large percentage of people would actually have access to it, much more than we thought. But I
is
mean, you
that
can
in
take that
England
number
or is
from
that
London, right? 30 to 40% of the male population. The population of London's about 30,000, say 15,000 males. 30 to 40%, you're looking at 5,000 people capable of reading in London. Right? It's
yeah.
especially considering the population of England as a whole at that time, it's a very, very small number.
Yeah, like I think all the populations were a lot smaller though, it's like apparently during like the Middle Ages, the population of Scandinavia was like extremely, extremely low. Like,
Mhm,
like
mhm.
it's like,
Yeah.
like I told you, I just read that biography of Saga of Harold Hardrada. Like it sounded like the population was super thin in those places. It makes sense too. If you go there today, like those countries, like take the population of Sweden, it's a lot less than say Germany or France or England.
Mhm.
Um,
Farming at that time was almost not possible for many, most, almost, I don't even know if it was possible to grow grain. It certainly was very, very difficult to grow grain in Sweden. And one of the things that coincides with the Black Death uh, uh, is the medieval cooling period, right, where global temperatures go down. And so a lot of land that was arable before that becomes not arable after. But in most of mainland Europe, right, Germany, France, it's not really a problem because the Black Death took out so many peasants that there's just a lot of land available again.
and,
And
and
so for
and
those areas,
apparently
it
it
wasn't a
became
big issue.
super
But in Scandinavia, it's a huge issue.
well.
But
No, and yeah, because I mean, just imagine it's getting even colder there. That's not exactly a warm place to begin with.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and yeah, no, but apparently, like in 1320 and 1330, the population of England and France was getting so big that it was like impossible to like afford land. So many people, only a fixed amount of land. But like after the Black Death, you could buy it for pennies on the dollar, or at least something like that. Um,
Well, forces. It's actually really interesting because it's. I mean, to dive into economics for a second. I mean, this is just a different question, but to dive into economics, the lords of base their wealth on their ownership of land and of primarily production of grain. Some would be grapes and stuff like that and wines, but primarily grain was the way that most lords got their wealth. It was from that. After the Black Death, there is a greater proportion of highly productive agricultural land to people in Europe, right? Because there's fewer people, but the same amount of highly productive agricultural land. And so the amount of grain produced per person goes up, which means the value of grain goes down. But to produce that, you still need labor, right? And so the value of labor goes up, but the cost of food goes down. And so the lords are absolutely hosed. The peasantry are doing great, but the great beneficiaries are the merchants, right? Because now they can trade in things that are not food, and people actually have a market for it. But the nobles are hosed because they have to pay more for labor and they get less from their land because the value of wheat has gone down. The value has, and the peasants, well, they get more for their labor and they're paying less for the food. And the nobles now and the merchants now have markets for goods other than wheat. So the long-term economic effect of this is to reduce the economic power of lords, increase the economic independence of the peasantry, or at least to a degree increase it, and vastly to increase the power of merchants, which is where you see which is why at that point in time in history you see the truly impressive rise of the merchant republics in Venice, Milan, and Genoa, to name a few, in Italy, and their meteoric rise, really, from that point up until the mid 1400s.
Interesting. So let's get back to chivalry for a second. Now, if the 100 Years' War ends in 1453, when is the last time that you know of that knights played a significant role in a battle, regardless if they were successful or not?
So it depends on how you define knight. So if by knight you mean heavily armored shock cavalry, I would say the last point where they truly make like a history-changing moment is the Siege of Vienna, where you have the winged hussars of the Polish king Jan Sobieski sweep away Turkey and save Western civilization. Right, that was the largest charge of heavy cavalry in the history of the world that we're aware of, or that I'm aware of, was on the plains before the Battle of Vienna in 1683, I want to say.
Yeah, they captured the Ottoman baggage train. It was such a horrible retreat for the Ottomans. They captured their baggage train and got a bunch of like armor and stuff like that.
I mean, you could say that those weren't knights, and I would probably agree with you, but the basic concept of heavy cavalry is still there and still very militarily effective there. Employed as heavy cavalry, you'll still see them in the 30 Years' War, employed as heavy cavalry. They're just being now employed along the flanks. They're not doing headlong charges towards the center of your enemy's lines. You're now using them around the flanks, around the edges, to defeat broken infantry. You see a resuscitation of heavy cavalry, not knights once again, but heavy cavalry in the Napoleonic era, where Napoleon likes to use heavy cavalry to cut through broken infantry squares, which are basically musketmen with bayonets fixed pointing outwards in giant squares to fend off cavalry. But if you could break those squares a little bit, cavalry could get in there, and heavy cavalry would just run them down and wipe them out. So the use of heavy cavalry against somewhat broken enemies is useful and used right up until, actually Lancers are used right up until the First World War. But obviously,
Wow.
they've long since ceased to be militarily effective.
Yeah. Well, didn't the Polish still have cavalry in the Second World War?
Yes, they did. I do not believe they had lance and sword, though, but I'm willing to be proven incorrect. I don't believe they ever did the lance, the myth of the lance and sword charge against the heavy cavalry. I think against the tanks. So I think it's a myth.
Against the Blitzkrieg, that wouldn't have worked well.
Yeah. But they typically would have been armed with a rifle and would have fought as mounted infantry. So they'd get to the battlefield, dismount, and fight, and then use their horses to add mobility to infantry, basically.
Okay. Wow. This is fascinating. Well, we're almost at an hour and a half. And yeah, no, that was interesting. Like this whole thing, like I learned a lot, and this all happened because you responded to my post on Twitter. Cavalry being obsolete after Crecy. You're like, whoa, hold on, So no, but this explains a lot, and your knowledge this is unparalleled. I don't even know anyone who knows even a sliver of what you know in terms of this stuff. Like like Cam, I could ask Cam like who was the best general in the Roman Empire in 120 AD, and you'll be like, oh, it's this guy. Like there's so much knowledge, and it's so exciting. Like you could talk about this for hours, and I would never get bored. Like just like that time we talked about Stalingrad. Just
it's a lot of fun. I love military history, so yeah, I have a lot of fun.
Yeah, no, and like who was that German general who had just got to St. Petersburg, and then he got pulled and they sent him down south?
Wallenstein.
Manstein. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Interesting. I just thought about that from our conversation, and like all those years ago. I just remember that day in Starbucks. That was good. But well, I won't keep you any longer, Cam. Do you have any final things to say? Do you want to give an update on the pro-life movement, or?
Well, I mean, if you're in Alberta, volunteer, get involved in the provincial election campaign, because heaven help us if Rachel Notley's NDP win. So,
yeah,
find a pro-life candidate, get involved.
I'm like I think Smith can pull through. Like I'm not saying Smith's a friend of the pro-life movement, but Smith I think can pull through, but I'm just afraid she's gonna torpedo herself.
That's my worry as well. But and you're right. Like Danielle Smith is not a friend of the pro-life movement, but I mean, I'll take the person who's not a friend to the person who actively wishes me harm. So
who's a sworn enemy? Yeah, Smith
exactly.
isn't friendly, but Smith compared to Notley is a cakewalk. All right, well, Cam, thank you so much for joining me, and
thanks for having me.
And God bless. I'll see you later.
God bless. Talk to you later. Bye.